This is episode 16 of the Relentless Man podcast. Learning, part 4, Tests of Learning. Hi, and welcome to the Relentless Man podcast. I'm your host, modjaiso, and my goal is to help men die empty. To make sure that you die having used up every ounce of potential that is trapped within you. However, to help you die empty, I will have to be very raw and brutally honest with you. So if you're easily offended, stop listening. If you're easily triggered, stop listening. If you can't handle explicit language, stop listening. If you're fragile, stop listening. Otherwise, let's dig in. In this episode, this is our final part, at least for a while, on learning. And in this episode, we're going to think about learning and the tests of learning. Now, before I'd given you a definition, I'd said that learning is really defined by TIA, taking in new information, internalizing the new information, and applying the new information to novel situations. Now, this definition of learning was accurate, but after making a couple of these episodes and thinking harder on the topic, I've actually decided to expand the definition and make it clearer. So here I want to give you my revised and what I think much better definition of learning, and also an expanded view of how you can determine whether or not you've learned something. So my new definition of learning is really TP. That is, learning is the process of taking in new information, that part is the same, but also penetrating to the core, getting to the essence of that new information. Taking in new information and penetrating to the core of that new information. TP. That is what I define learning to be. Taking in information makes sense. It's the same as it's been before. Taking in information refers to getting information from the external world and getting it into your brain through one of the senses or a mixture of them. And then penetrating to the core of new information refers to getting to the essence, discovering the underlying principles that describe that new information that you've just taken in. Basically, if you've learned something, it means you've penetrated to the core and understand the principles by which that new information, skill, concept really works. That being said, how do you know if you've truly learned something? How do you know if you've really penetrated to the core of that new information? So this is really a question of the tests of learning. What are the tests of learning? So we've done a couple of tests of learning before. So here I want to give you an integrated list of all of that. One test of learning we saw before was application to novel situations. That means that if you've really penetrated to the core of an idea, if you've really learned an idea, then you should be able to get that idea and apply it to a context that is different from the context in which you learned it. If you're able to apply information to novel situations and contexts, then we say you've really learned that information. So we already know that. That's the first test, application to novel situations. Another test we looked at was force. That is, if you need to use excessive force to do something, that is a sign that you don't really know how to do that thing. For instance, if, let's say you're learning how to ride a bike, and you're riding this bike but with a lot of concentration, and you need to look at the brakes and think about how to press them. If you need to use so much energy to ride this bike, that's a sign that you haven't really grasped the core principles of how the bike works. Because if you'd grasp the core principles, you wouldn't need to use so much effort. You'd be able to ride the bike while thinking of other things without even looking or thinking about the bike at all. So that is, the fact that you're using so much energy and force is a sign that you haven't really learned how to ride a bike. So then a test of learning becomes, if you're able to do an activity or using new information without needing to focus too much or without using so much force, then that's a sign that you've really understood how that new information or skill works, that you've penetrated the core of this skill or information that you're trying to learn. Now, obviously, you want to be careful because sometimes certain things require a certain degree of force. So if you're always looking to do things with minimal force, sometimes you can't go lower, or it's unsustainable or unwise to go lower than a certain level. So for instance, as we mentioned in a previous episode, let's say you're someone if you have to use, physical violence, or if you have to shout and raise your voice at people, it's usually a sign that you don't have good enough social skills. Because if you had mastered and learned social skills, you'd never need to use so much energy and put yourself in such a negative state. However, sometimes you're dealing with people who, what if you're dealing with someone who is not the sort of person that you debate or have discussions with? What if you're dealing with someone who is violent and you don't have time to debate with them? If you're really seeking for the good solution, if you're trying to use as little force as possible, then what's going to happen is you're going to try to reason with someone who really can't be reasoned with. The sort of person who you have to defend yourself physically and violently against. So you want to be careful, obviously. So a test of learning is to use minimal force, but you want to make sure that you're not using less force than is necessary, or that you get so obsessed with using less force that you don't recognize situations in which force is the only way to do things. So this is a test of learning, but you want to be careful and make sure you're applying it correctly. Just like in the application to novel situations that we just discussed before, as a general rule, yes, if you're able to apply new information to a new context, then you've learned it. But the situation better be new. If you're riding a bike on a flat surface and then all of a sudden you move, let's say, to a different location where the surface is not as flat but just a little tilted. It's a different situation, sure, but it's not sufficiently different. So we can't say that you've really learned how to ride a bike under those circumstances. If you're going to apply new information to a novel situation, then it better be a situation that is significantly different from the situation in which you learned it. If you're riding downhill at top speed, that's significantly different from riding on a flat surface. So every test of learning I'm going to give you here, make sure you understand what it is and you apply it to your own situation. And you understand it for yourself in your own way. Another test of learning that we saw is speed. That is, if you're able to do something quickly, then that's a sign that you really know how to do that thing. If someone is able to speak really fast, and speak correctly, of course, then that's a sign that they really know how to speak. Because it would be very hard, let's say, to speak really fast in a foreign language that you don't know. So another test of learning is, can you do that thing? Can you apply that skill or concept really quickly? However, here we want to be careful. You want to make sure that when you're doing something quickly, you also want to do it well. So if you are able to speak a language really quickly but with a lot of mistakes, then we can't say you really understand how the language works. What would test whether you learn if you want to use the speed test, you want to be able to speak the language really fast without very minimal mistakes. That would be a sign that you've really grasped how the language works. So speed is another test, but you want to be careful. Make sure that you're not just doing things quickly, but you're doing things quickly and well. And if you're able to do that, then we say you've really learned that thing. Another test of learning is teaching. If you're able to teach new information to somebody, if let's say you want to test whether you know something, try and see if you can teach it to somebody else. If you can successfully teach it to somebody else, then that's a sign that you really understand the core and the essence of that information, of whatever it is that you're trying to teach. So the cliche, the statement people always make, the best way to learn is to teach, has a lot of sense to it. But we don't want to get derailed, of course. So if you're going to teach something, you want to make sure that the thing that you're teaching in a way that is different and varied. If you keep teaching in exactly the same way, using the exact same examples, then that's a sign that maybe you haven't really understood the concept well enough. For instance, if let's say you're trying to teach someone, let's say you don't know, you've just learned the English language and you're testing whether you've really learned English or not. And so you're explaining to somebody else, and let's say you want to express the idea that you're teaching somebody and you want to tell them how you say, I'm going to the toilet in the English language. And let's say that every time they ask you, the only way you say it is, oh yeah, going to the toilet, going to the toilet, going to the toilet. See, yes, you've been able to teach them how to say going to the toilet, but that's not a sign that you've really mastered the English language. Why? Because if you're only able to say it or explain it in one way, that's a sign that you don't really understand it well enough. If you're able to teach, let's say, someone how to say go to the toilet in varied ways, then would be more confident of your ability to speak the language. If you're able to say, go to the bathroom, go to the toilet, relieve yourself, answer the call of nature, urinate, poop. If you have this varied vocabulary, these varied ways of explaining and teaching a concept to someone, then that's a sign that you really know and have really learned that concept or idea or skill. So that's another test of learning, is teaching. The final test of learning is independence. That is, another test of whether you've learned something is if you're able to do that thing without relying on external sources. So for instance, when you see a public speaker, let's say, make a presentation without reading any notes, without looking at a screen, without being prompted by anything, purely from their own brain, you get a certain confidence. You get a sense that they really have mastered the content that they're talking about. The fact that they have to keep referring to notes and teleprompters and looking for cues is a sign that they haven't really grasped the information. So that really becomes another test of learning then, is if you want to know if you've learned something, one way to check is, are you able to use that new information, apply that skill without any external guidance and without any help at all from anybody else? If you're able to do that, if you're able to use information without external guidance, if you're independent, that is, if you're able to use the skill or information independent of anything or anyone else, then that's also a sign that you've really learned and penetrated to the core of that information. Because if you hadn't, you'd need external guidance, some help from somebody. Of course, you want to be careful with this as well, because just because you're not relying on external sources doesn't mean you want to be careful too, because it's possible for you to, for instance, imagine the guy who's giving a speech and not relying on any external sources. It's possible that the reason they're able to give this speech without relying on anything else independently is because they've memorized every single word that they were supposed to give. That is, everything is memorized in sequence. Now, this doesn't necessarily, it looks very confident, but it's not also a sign of learning, because learning is more than just memorizing information. You want to be able to play around with the information and use it and really grasp the core principles. So in this case, if the person is able to make the presentation without referring to any other sources, but they also haven't memorized the information, then that's a sign that they've truly learned that information. So when it comes to independence, you want to make sure that you're able to do that thing without external guidance, but that you're not just following some sort of routine or rigid procedure, that you're still able to vary your approaches and use that information differently. The point that comes from this test of independence is the idea that just because we've seen 5 different tests of learning doesn't mean they should be looked at in isolation. It's in fact a wise idea to combine them. That is, you want to be able to do the thing independently, but also you want to be able to use the information in varied situations. If you use the test of independence and use the test of using information in new contexts, those 2 tests together will really help you see whether you've learned something. That is, the 5 tests don't have to be looked at in isolation. You can actually look at them, combine them to test whether or not you've really learned something. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. This podcast is your podcast, and I am here to serve you, to make sure that you have the mindset you need to have in order to realize your potential and die empty. So if you have any comment, any suggestion, any question, please email me. My email is in the episode description. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening and have a relentless week. Bye.